everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Jessica Lawrence. I am a lead analyst here at Artilist and a registered practitioner with the CMMC Accreditation Board. And I will be hosting our event today. As a few admin notes, I noticed we already got a question about recording. We are going to be recording this webinar and sending it out to all of our registrants later this week. Also, you'll notice everyone is muted, so you can't actually interact with us directly, but you will be able to ask questions, and we encourage you to do so. The whole format of this particular webinar is going to be kind of a Q&A. So we have a lot of questions that we're already going to be answering, and I suspect that we'll cover a lot of what you ask. But please go ahead and ask in the chat box. And then just as kind of a note, we're not really taking any like software technology type questions. This is really just kind of a discussion of the DFARS rule and the DIBCAC process and DCMA's role. If you are interested in that kind of help, that's kind of what Artilist does. We're a registered provider organization with the CMMC AB, and we offer a lot of services to help you understand these requirements and build your programs. So including a free evaluation just to help you get through your self-assessment if you have any questions about that. So please visit our website. It's artilist.com. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce our guest speaker today, Mr. John Ellis. Mr. Ellis is the director for the DCMA or DCMA's software division and responsible for policy training, the cybersecurity audit kind of stuff that you're looking for when you're getting assessed for your compliance with NIST 800-171. He's also a retired Army colonel and served on active duty for 30 years. And I think about 20 of those years, feel free to fact check me, Mr. Ellis, about 20 of those years was with the Army Acquisition Corps. So you have been definitely steeped in the DoD acquisition world for a long time. So welcome back. We had you actually as a panelist as one of our panelists on a conference that we did exactly a month ago today. So really happy to have you back with us today.
Well, it's good to be here with you. As Jessica said, you know, I'm not doing a briefing. I'm not going to have a bunch of charts. I'm actually not going to have any charts. The intent is to answer questions and sort of have a conversation about what's going on, talk about the rule changes that are out there. There's still a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt as folks look at what's coming their way and what's it really mean for them, or what does it not mean. So I'm a pretty much a straight shooting kind of guy. I'll tell you the way I see it. What I intend to do is hit a few highlights here at first, and just as sort of a backdrop, and I'll try to answer any questions that folks have on their mind. And if I don't know the answer, I'll tell you I don't know. And if it's one of those questions where I really should not answer, I will tell you I'm not going to answer that. You know, because let's face it, every now and then you get one of those, you know, if the aliens invade questions, I'm not qualified to answer those questions. So first thing, I'm not a lawyer, and I hope that puts me in good standing with most of you. I'm not a contracting officer, even though I've been an acquisition guy for a long time. I'm not one of those guys. So my background as an acquisition guy is a PM, an engineer, and IT background. So with that in mind, let's talk about the basic rule, or the interim rule that came out 30 November. It actually has two major parts, even though it introduced, you know, 3 new clauses / provisions. It has two major parts. There's a part that affects the current DoD Assessment Methodology, and then of course CMMC. And CMMC is the 800-pound gorilla in the room, and I think we're all aware of that. And I can address either of those as we sit and talk this afternoon. First part of the rule deals with requiring companies to load their self-assessment scores into SPRS, the Supplier Performance Risk System. I will tell you, and I haven't looked since last week, but the last time I looked last week, the count of self-assessment scores in the system had already breached 11,000 and was growing rapidly. Prior to the rule, the interim rule going out the door, we had a couple hundred. So that's a big positive. So the first aspect of the first part of the new rule as put your stuff in spurs. And the second part of it is if the government asks you to perform an assessment, you gotta let us in. Believe it or not, prior to that interim rule coming out, it was voluntary to undergo assessments. And a lot of folks are familiar with the DIBCAC, our Defense Industrial Base Cybersecurity Assessment Center, that has been doing assessments now since June of 2019, and they've done a lot of work with industry up to this point. So I can talk about those things if anybody has questions as well. The second part of the rule obviously introduces CMMC. So I'm gonna put a question out that I hear all the time, sort of to help set the stage. And a lot of companies will ask, now that CMMC is coming along, what should we do to get ready? Well, I can tell you what you should do to get ready. You should be fully compliant with the current 800-171 requirements that the 7012 clause puts in place, because you're going to need to be fully compliant at that 800-171 level to meet your eventual CMMC level 3 requirement. CMMC level 3 is the equivalency, if you will, to the current standard. It is based on 800-171 plus some additional 20 requirements to document process maturity, continuous improvement, those sorts of activities. So you need to have all of those requirements firmly in place, because under CMMC, you cannot have a POAM, meaning you can't have unmet requirements as part of your certification. Under the current methodology, and for those of you that have actually gone through the process of putting scores into spurs and working with that system, you obviously can put in a score of less than 110, which is the maximum score under the methodology we're using today. But you also put in a POAM completion date, when you expect to have your program of plans of action and milestones completed to fully implement those requirements. So while you can have a POAM in place today and be fully compliant from a contract clause perspective, under CMMC, you cannot achieve a required level with POAMs. So how do you get ready for CMMC? You get fully compliant today. You don't stop and you don't wait. Stopping and waiting put yourself and your company's intellectual property at risk. And when you do that, you put the government's information at risk. And that's what these requirements are all about anyway. It's protecting that information. So with that, Jessica, what kind of questions do you guys have?
Unmute myself. Yeah, well, so can you, I was actually gonna, to be honest with you, I was gonna start out a little bit simpler just before we really dived into the DFARS rule, and just kind of talk a little bit about what DCMA is and what DIBCAC actually is, because I think a lot of people don't really necessarily know the roles.
Fair enough. So DCMA is an organization, it's a Defense Contract Management Agency, and it is a DoD fourth estate organization that has the responsibility to administer contracts that have been delegated to it by the services and agencies. DCMA manages, a couple 100,000 contracts at any given time, and in support of all the services and agencies, literally around the world. We work very closely with the contracting, with the Defense Industrial Base. In some cases, we have personnel located at plant locations where they interact with companies on a daily basis in terms of managing contracts, performing quality assessments, overlooking documentation from an engineering perspective, software perspective. We have industrial specialists that look at process flows and production flows. So DCMA has this multifunctional capability to administer contracts and to ensure that deliverables are meeting those contractual requirements. And so DCMA has a large role to play in that. The DIBCAC is a fairly new portion of DCMA. It was literally created in the spring of 2019 as a result of some direction given to us by the then Miss Lord, who was the then ANS lead at OSD. So Ellen Lord in February of 2019 issued a letter to DoD that said we need to figure out how to do enterprise level assessments, and DCMA tag your it. That's pretty much what it says. The fun part of what it also did was put my name on a document, and you don't know how popular you are until you're on a Miss Lord signed memo, because everybody and their brother and sister is calling you 24/7, 365 afterwards. We stood up an organization in approximately 90 days. For those of you familiar with government operations, that's warp speed or moving at the speed of light, whichever analogy you would like. And starting in June of 2019, we began conducting assessments using the OSD CIO developed scoring methodology that we continue to use today. The initial pilot phase of assessments was of 16. We conducted 16 assessments, primarily focused on large DIB companies for a couple of reasons. One, they have the most robust cyber protection mechanisms. They have a lot of expertise, a lot of smart folks, and quite honestly, we use them to refine the process and also to explore some future requirements that are not in play yet because of the work they're doing today. So we conducted the pilot phase. All were successful. All those companies were not 100% compliant, to be honest with you, and we didn't expect them to be. But for the most part, the really big companies were all either very close or were fully compliant. And since then, they have closed out their POAMs and are good to go. But we literally transitioned immediately from pilot phase into full operational phase in October of 2019. There was really no break in service, if you will, between the pilot phase and going forward. Since then, we operate with a capacity of around 110 assessments a year. DCMA had to get really creative when the zombie apocalypse began about a year ago. For those of you that don't know, we focus on the high confidence assessments. The assessment methodology has 3 levels: basic, the self-assessment that you guys should be familiar with. Medium and high are conducted by the government. A high confidence assessment is the one where we actually show up on your doorstep and go through everything with you. That's what we had been focusing on before the COVID travel restrictions kicked into play. And after that, we had to come up with some creative virtual means to conduct assessments, and have done so since then. In addition to all the DoD assessment stuff that we're doing, we're also and have been a key player in the establishment of CMMC. So DCMA has been involved in its development and establishment since day one, actually from day 0, because part of the conversation, for those of you that may have heard Miss Katie Arrington in various webinars, she tells a story of how we kind of came about the need for a CMMC mechanism. At DCMA, we were part of that conversation. And here we are today. We're in we're taking the baby steps to start a 5-year phased rollout of CMMC. So DCMA has been involved in all of those things, and in fact, we will be conducting the very first assessment of a third-party assessor next week in preparation for establishing those third-party assessors under the CMMC, accreditation board construct. So we're working with the CMMC program office to check off and make sure that those requirements are met so that the pilot can continue going forward. What else would you like to know?
Well, a couple of the questions that I know we here at Artilist tend to get a lot are, and you touched on this a little bit, but I'm going to dive into it a little bit more. Where do we start, first of all? And I know Katie Arrington has really talked a lot about how these 3 new clauses kind of give you the path to take. It's kind of the crawl, walk, run that she talks about, crawl being the self-assessment. And the requirements that came out in the 7019 aren't really much more than what you were already supposed to be doing anyway. And then 7020 with the government assessments, and then CMMC. And of course, if you meet the 7019 requirements, you're really well set up to be able to meet level 3 requirements for CMMC, because it's 110 controls in NIST 171, 130 in level 3. And presumably, it's not going to take that much work to make that bridge from one to the other, correct?
It should not. That is correct. So I'm gonna say something just to make sure we're all on the same sheet of music. You'll notice that I don't refer to 800-171 as controls like you would under an 853 construct, which is the government standard. I use the requirements term, and there's a reason for that. So requirements are because it's. Are you hearing an echo, or is it just my imagination?
I think it's just you.
Okay, well.
Coming through loud and clear here.
Good. So, you know, the requirements are all about the protections in company-owned systems. We, the government, can't direct a company to use, you know, method A or method B to meet a particular requirement from 800-171. So there's a lot of variability, and there's a lot of latitude and flexibility in how companies can actually implement the 110 requirements. So that's one of the reasons why I don't refer to them as controls. Just sharing that in case there's any concern that I'm talking past you. And I know they're in a lot of ways they're synonymous, but they're not. So I just wanted to share that up front. But you are right. So if you think about the baby steps to get ready for CMMC, you've got the foundational starting point of the current 7012 clause, which says go do 800-171. 800-171 is the core of those same requirements at CMMC level 3. Oh, by the way, for those of you that have been through a high confidence assessment with DCMA, you are already documenting self-assessments, because that's part of the pre-coordination that takes place before we showed up. That new 7019 clause sort of indoctrinates the requirement for companies to self-assess and put their scores into SPURS. One of the reasons why that requirement came about was companies were self-attesting that they were doing things, and to be blunt, they weren't. So we came up with a mechanism to be a little more proactive in documenting that self-attestation, because quite honestly, and this is something that I know it sounds kind of mean, but as a government entity looking at a requirement that's been around in its final form since December of 2017, when companies come back and say, we got these new requirements that we have to deal with, they're not going to get a lot of sympathy from us. So I just need to forewarn you of that. So at the end of the day, you set yourself up by future CMMC success by fully implementing and embracing the requirements you have today. Putting stuff into SPURS, get used to it, because there'll have to be a reporting mechanism for the documentation of CMMC, coming down the road. I can also tell you from one of the questions that comes up in this regard is, hey, I'm a prime. Can I see my supplier scores in SPURS? The answer is no, you cannot. You can only see your own scores. However, I know this is going to sound like a radical concept. If you would like your suppliers to give you a copy or input or a report of what they loaded into SPURS, I know this is going to sound crazy. Ask them for it. I know that sounds crazy. But if a company has done their self-assessment, there should be no reason why they can't share that information with you. And if you're a prime and you have a supplier that doesn't want to share information, I'm going to also say something that's rather blunt. If you have a supplier that doesn't want to share, you might want to think about finding another supplier. Unless they're so mutually exclusive that they're the only somebody you can go to for something, you as a prime have a responsibility to figure out a way to share information with them safely. So if they can't do it themselves, there are things you can do as a prime to share information with those companies, whether you provide them a laptop, you give them a secure environment to operate within your network, whatever the case may be.
And I would think, I mean, it's kind of built in to this whole set of requirements as well with the POAM. Like, that is your tool to use to get to the point where you are actually fully compliant. You just need, you find your gaps, you fill those gaps, and by the time CMMC rolls around in a few years, you'll be ready to go. And then I know that CMMC, you can't have a POAM and have gaps, but you're still going to have that as a tool to use to continue to maintain that certification throughout the future.
Oh, absolutely.
Every 3 years, right?
So let's be honest with ourselves. The whole cyber protection schema is not static. It has to be dynamic. It has to grow. It has to evolve. The difference between 800-171, the current standard, under the DoD Assessment Methodology, and really the focus of CMMC, is CMMC indoctrinates and documents those needs to further mature the continuous improvement and the process maturity things that 800-171 lacks. There are folks that believe, I have checked the block, I've met all the requirements today, and I'm going to be good to go for 3 years. Well, that's if you take that attitude, you're going to be good for about a nanosecond, because if you look at the basis of our cyber protection schemas, if you have any insider knowledge into those areas, you know that threat is constantly changing. It's constantly evolving. And if you don't stay ahead of the game, well, then you'll get kicked right out of the game. So what CMMC does is helps to form that basis of maturity, process improvement, and continued growth that's 800-171 in its current form does not do.
Mm-hmm.
And one other thing, because you made a really good point, a POAM should be a very useful tool for a company to use to ensure that they make the right resource commitments, they make the right decisions to fully work off anything that's not fully implemented. Use it as a self-accountability tool to get yourself fully compliant, because you really need to do those things in a deliberate, mature fashion. If you don't, and you wait till the 11th hour, you may find that you have some gaps that you can't bridge, which means you can't compete for those future contracts that have a CMMC requirement. So it's all about preparation. It's about being well informed and holding yourselves accountable. Because I'll tell you, one of the things I hear often in sessions like this is, well, if the maximum score under the current DoD assessment methodology is 110, what's a passing score? Well, a passing score is 110. Meet them all. There is no pass or fail. There's really no A, B, or C. You can start using the scores to assess risk, but I'll ask a rhetorical question: what's better, a score of 100 or a score of 100? You don't know unless you know what areas you're actually deficient in. And in fact, a different example I've used is, what's better, a score of 90 or 100? Everybody says 100. Not necessarily. The 90 may be a stronger organization if you know the gaps that may be presented, vice the other organization has a 10-point higher score. We've seen it both ways. Mm-hmm. But the reality is that POAM, to your point, Jessica, can be a very useful tool for companies to hold themselves accountable, to put a successful glide path in place to get them set up for that future CMMC success.
Yeah, actually, we've had some internal conversations around Artlist, and we were actually just talking about this the other day. That one of the questions that we got during the conference was that they thought it was kind of silly to be kind of working toward a score of 0, so to speak, because you can go into the negatives with this scoring methodology. And one of the things that we were saying is that it actually kind of mentally helps you realize that just passing, there is no such thing as passing, but just passing is not enough in this particular case. We're so used to that being, oh, if I get a 70, then I passed. If I get a 69, I fail. So that 1-point difference is great, and that's just not enough in this particular situation. So.
No, it absolutely is not. And to your point, so the scoring methodology is a weighted scoring mechanism. Some requirements are more important than others, and they carry a higher score. So there's a lot of folks that go, oh, wow, this is great. I got 110 requirements and the max score is 110. Both of those are absolutely true. The reality, though, is that the bottom score, the bottom end of the scale, is not zero. The bottom end of the scale, and don't quote me on this, I think it's minus 274. It's a ridiculously low, small number. We have seen folks at the significant digits of minus scores.
Mm-hmm.
That's okay if those companies, it's not okay that they're not meeting all their requirements. I don't mean it that way, but it is okay if they're actually proactively engaged to work their POAM to get fully implemented to meet requirements. The 800-171 requirements represent, what is considered minimal protections. They're not intended to keep advanced persistent threats out of your networks and systems. They are meant to meet the fundamental building block basics that you would hope any company in today's modern, interweb connected world was doing to protect itself and its own intellectual property and the property of its customers, and in this case, the Department of Defense and our CUI.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I want to ask one of the questions that came in before we get too far away from something that you mentioned earlier about the, next week you're going to be doing the first assessment of a third-party assessor. So how would you characterize the significance of that? Is the program ahead or behind schedule? And in addition to that, they ask, what did the SolarWinds hack do, in your opinion, to validate the need for CMMC and possibly indicate the need to streamline CMMC sooner rather than later?
So I'm gonna let me start by saying we're right on schedule in terms of sort of the initial rollout, if you will, of CMMC. So we're right within the bursting radius of when we expected to start doing the third-party assessments. Nothing remarkable to talk about there. No significant impacts in terms of CMMC timelines. So those things are going pretty much to plan. Nothing too crazy in that regard. What was the second part of the question?
Oh, it was bringing up the recent SolarWinds hack and just
that's right.
like validate the need for CMMC.
So SolarWinds. So if you take a step back and look at the way SolarWinds came about, would the fundamental question and answer would be, would CMMC have prevented SolarWinds? Well, the answer is really not really. However, what is in place today and further gets strengthened under CMMC is a reporting requirement of companies have a responsibility today that within 72 hours of knowledge of an incident, they're supposed to report it into DIBNet. So I'm going to say, make a rather bold statement here that there's a lot of companies around the world that do work with DoD that use SolarWinds, and I would have expected to see a whole bunch of possible reports, possible issue reports in DIBNet. And guess what? That is not the case. There's a few, don't get me wrong. There is a few out there, but there is not there was not a groundswell of reports. So CMMC still relies upon the same, 7012 clause and the self-reporting requirement. What I'm hoping under CMMC that'll be slightly different is an increased awareness because of that certification process for companies that take that reporting mechanism stronger and make it more part of their doing business. But would SolarWinds have protected it? No, but what it does bring to light, take the SolarWinds hack out of it, which, by the way, for those of us that are cyber geeks, you gotta, and if our friends, the Russians, are on this call, from an elegance of the attack vector and the way that was done, you got to give those guys credit. Our adversaries are smart. They take advantages of things that a lot of folks take for granted. And if you look at what happened with that attack, there was some things taken for granted, and there was a price to be paid for it. So you got to admire the way that was done. You don't have to like the outcome. You don't have to like the impact, but you do need to admire from an academic perspective the elegance of that attack vector. Very smart. And if you think our adversaries aren't smart, just look at SolarWinds as an example.
Mm-hmm. And I was just going to piggyback on that a little bit. The United States is kind of accustomed, I think, over the last 70 years or so, of kind of dominating most of the fields of warfare, and we're really waking up to the fact right now, is that with SolarWinds certainly as an example, but also just in the past year, this massive digital transformation we've had to remote work and the need to secure our networks, and just how vulnerable that really is to the rest of the world.
Absolutely. So everybody on this call, whether you're at home or you're at work, 24/7, 365, somebody is trying to get into your network. And in some cases, they're successful. In other cases, they are not. I can tell you anecdotally, that's been several years ago when I was doing my thesis at the War College. Part of my study was to take a pristine firewall that had never been connected to any network in the world. It was brand new, connected up to a home ISP address, and then begin doing data capture and logging and reverse lookups on who was knocking on my front door, so to speak. Within moments, I was already logging entries from both Russia and China. And not the script kiddie next door. Of course, there was a bunch of those guys too. But third party, host nation or third party nation government entities, because the beauty of the internet is the IP structure. You can do a lot of things and go back and look up who's probing, and that was 2008. And it's far more advanced and far more prevalent now. The bad guys are out there, and if you don't do the basics, it's only a matter of time.
Mm-hmm. So going back to specifically talking about some of these assessments, what is the scope of a DIBCAC assessment? And kind of, I think a related question that we got was how much documentation is required? What kind of evidence are you looking for?
So two things. One, our assessment follows how a company defines its enterprise. As you guys can all imagine, the variability is nearly infinite from a very large enterprise at a multi-location corporate environment to a mom and pop operating at out of a small office in the middle of nowhere, America, and we've seen the entire range. But the scope, if you will, of what's in bounds for the assessment is determined through coordination with each company as they define their network and their architecture, and then our guys show up and do look for evidence that what was communicated is what is it actually being done. So part of the assessment is to come to an agreement on what that architecture entails, what's in and out of scope. So in the classic defense acquisition university spirit, it depends, and it depends on those variables. The second part, though, is actually the easiest part. So the artifacts that we look for are all of those things that are described in 800-171 alpha, the assessment guide that goes with 800-171. And those two documents really tie back to the DoD Assessment Methodology document. So if you have those three documents and you understand what the requirements ask for, if you look at the assessment guide and you understand how to demonstrate that you're meeting those requirements, because that's what the alpha does. It literally gives you the criteria. It tells you all the things we're going to ask you. It tells you all the things we're going to ask that be demonstrated or shown to us. And then if you go back and look at the scorecard, you know how the test is going to be graded. So you know what point values get associated with what. Because there's so much clarity between those three documents, the good thing is for those high confidence assessments that we've performed, in most cases, companies have been very, very accurate in looking at their self-assessments and how it compares to their eventual DIBCAC assigned score. Been very, very close. In most cases, actually, companies are harder on themselves than they ought to be, which is good. Getting back to your question in terms of policies and documents, how many does that really translate to? Once again, that depends on the complexity and the size of the organization, and then how you may or may not document, your various policies. We've seen instances where literally every requirement has almost its own standalone policy. We've seen others where it's more of a compendium, if you will, a combined document of multiple policies and practices, I almost want to say in the form of a handbook. So there's a lot of variability between numbers, so numbers won't really help. But if you do understand what is required by looking at the assessment guide, you'll be much better served. That's exactly what we use. Mm-hmm. It could not be a more transparent process.
Okay. One of the questions actually is, and I think I'm understanding this correctly, but I think it kind of speaks to whether or not the government kind of recommends, especially for a small business that doesn't have like a big IT team or anything like that, that they actually contract out, consulting services to look for, to get help with the CMMC, a gap assessment and getting ready for all of these requirements.
So you're never going to hear John Ellis or one of the DIBCAC guys go, you should go hire a consultant. That would be inappropriate. Two, that's really a business decision that each company needs to make based on its knowledge, expertise, resources, how much risk they're willing to take or assume for themselves. I will tell you, yeah, I'm fairly geeky, and I'm not exaggerating much when I say this. The implementing the basic requirements for 800-171 are not that difficult. They're not, but it means you do have to have some folks with a little bit of technical knowledge and expertise. You got to spend some time and money to put those mechanisms in place and document those policies and practices. I'm not downplaying any of that. And the larger your company you have, the more complex some of those things can get. The decision to bring in a third party to help you may be a very good decision. I would recommend, though, if you're going to do that, that you vet it to the extent that you can the companies that you may be dealing with. We have seen companies that quite honestly can't spell cyber trying to advise others. There's a lot of folks out there that see CMMC as a get-rich opportunity. I'm going to win the lottery. I'm going to become one of these companies. I'm going to make a lot of money. That could happen. But you don't want to be the guinea pig of reaching out to a company and bringing in an advisor, spend a lot of money, and get nothing in return. The other thing I need to make sure I'm 1,000% clear on, even if you outsource your IT infrastructure, or even if you bring in consultants, even if you do any of those sort of third-party implementations and extensions of your network, if there's an issue, the government, don't hold them responsible. We hold the prime contractor responsible for the outcomes. So if you outsource things, that's fine, as long as it meets your requirements and meets the need. But if there's an issue, I don't go knocking on the door of your outsource partner. I knock on your door, and then we have an adult conversation from there as far as what happens afterwards.
Mm-hmm. Is there a resource for accepted, unaccepted IT solutions for NIST controls? They use the word controls.
I am not aware of any sort of list that It says, these things will get you, closer to 800-171 compliance. I'm not. On that note, because there can be so much variability about how a company implements protections, I want to make it clear that we, the DIBCAC guys and the services and agency folks that we have trained, I don't want to forget them. We do not grade on style. So by that, I mean, sometimes we see implementations that are not our preferred solution. We may not like what we see, but as long as it meets the requirement, we give credit for it. Because quite honestly, there's a wide variability of how some of these things can be implemented. With that, I do also want to say, you cannot go buy 800-171 in a can. That product does not exist. And if you think it should, then you haven't looked at the requirement itself. So while, yes, there are some cyber requirements and some technical wizardry things that are embedded in the requirements, there's also a lot of physical things. There's training requirements and physical access requirements and facilities requirements. There are things that must be done at the local level, regardless of where the enterprise exists. Extend that even further into the cloud. So a lot of folks think, hey, if I go to a FedRAMP, medium or higher cloud environment, I'm covered, right? Well, you're covered for some things, but you still got to do end user protection. You still got to do facilities and training and certification and all those other things other than the cyber stuff. So the best advice I can give folks is, before you let somebody try to talk you into a product, you go get familiar with what's actually in the requirement.
Yeah, and one of the things that I know that we talk about a lot is that this is no longer just an IT problem, and that's how it's traditionally been thought of. But I mean, it really requires, especially with the maturity processes and the policies and everything that you need to create. This is a company-wide structure that you have to create, so that that people know what the policies are. People are buying, that people at the top levels are buying into these policies and saying, yes, this is how we want this to run, so that it doesn't disrupt our business in this particular way. These are the risks that we're willing to take on. So yeah, it isn't just a technology solution by far.
No, it's a holistic approach, and that's why when you look at the 800-171 requirements, it's very comprehensive to lay out, what that minimum level of protection, that foundational set of requirements is. So because of that, you can't just decide that, hey, these 3 requirements don't apply to me and just ignore them. If you do, well, you'll get no score for that, and you will be found to be non-compliant. And it also demonstrates a lack of understanding of what the requirements entails. The question comes up very often, hey, I'm a one-person operation. Yes, I do handle CUI. What do I need to do? Well, you need to protect the CUI. You need to go get 800-171. What you guys can't see in the screenshot of this really ugly guy that keeps talking to you and babbling on, just to my left over here is my home server that is running 24/7, 365. That if I brought my DIBCAC guys over here and they started doing an assessment, they would find it meets those cyber requirements. Now, I don't have a scan lock on my front door, but you do have a keypad entry to get into the building. So I actually have, 2 doors to get into my data center and all those wonky things. But what I'm telling you, just sort of tongue in cheek, is these things can be achieved for not a lot of money. How did I implement multi-factor? I bought a $28 YubiKey. It's on my keychain in the other room. And part of the dongle is plugged into the machine I'm using right now. So at the end of the day, there are affordable, scalable solutions that are all over the place, depending on the complexity and the needs of an organization, to meet those requirements. And I encourage companies to make use of just the general knowledge of looking at the assessment documents, looking at the standard. If you need help, reach out to those mature and capable companies to help you, from a consultancy perspective, to meet your path forward. because I'm telling you right now, the importance that you can't really wait for CMMC. You need to get ahead of doing your preparations, because that POAM thing is a big deal. I can tell you there's a lot of companies that we have assessed that have self-assessed, that have POAMs, and they will not be successful under a CMMC microscope when that time comes, meaning they won't be able to compete for the work that they would like to compete for.
Mm-hmm.
So get the work done, get it done now. One, it protects yourself, but two, it'll let you be more successful in the future.
And it's not something you can just slap together a week before your assessment. You're going to have to show that you've actually had these things in place for a certain amount of time.
Well, to that point, I want to advise companies of this. My DIBCAC guys, they're pretty awesome. We really lucked out. We have an extraordinary group of folks, very diverse backgrounds, highly skilled. Within minutes of them showing up at a company's location and looking through their policies and practices, looking at their SSP, their system security plan, looking at the evidentiary things that we start an assessment with, within minutes, we know if a company pencil whipped their policies and practices or they're actually eating their own dog food. It only takes a few minutes to get to kind of get that Kentucky windage of where the company is. And I'm telling you, for your own sake, you don't want to be that company that has a bunch of things that you cobbled together at the 11th hour, because yeah, you might get through the assessment more or less. The scores will reflect it, but you're just fooling yourselves when it comes down to it, and you're putting yourself at risk. And that's the most important aspect of this, not whether DCMA gives you a good score or not. It's really more of a, if you're not taking this stuff seriously, exercising your due diligence, then the thing that makes you who you are, that intellectual property that makes, Acme thumbtacks, if you don't protect that, then you won't be Acme thumbtacks very long. Your competitors will either have your information, or our adversaries will have it. If you want to know why some ships and planes and weapons platforms and on and on and on look just like our stuff, it's because it is our stuff. We did all the hard work, the thinking, the engineering, and somebody else came along and stole it from us. There's no coincidence there. That is proactive, engaged adversaries taking advantage of us, taking shortcuts and making bad decisions. That's a fact. No hyperbole at all.
And then we also got some questions about, like, how do I upload my stuff into SPURS? How do I get access to SPURS and things like that? So, where is the best place for them to find the resources they need online to kind of get that information? Because I know it exists out there.
So the place I point a lot of folks to is the DoD Procurement Toolbox. A lot of you should be familiar with that. If you just Googled it, you would get a link to it's an OSD acquisition and sustainment website. There's a cybersecurity section. It's got FAQs. It's got resource links. A lot of the things that we're talking about here could be found there. You can also Google SPURS, SPRS. And from that, you can go to the SPURS launch page, for no better way to put it. It'll have some links of how do you sign up for an account. I believe there's some other resources that if you guys don't have them, Jessica, I can send to you, and you can share it with folks in terms of links to SPURS and the SPURS help desk and the PII help desk. A lot of things, a lot of folks seem to think that like DCMA has some. We don't manage SPURS. We don't manage PIEE. We actually use those. We're users. But we can point you to the help desk stuff, which is exactly what I would do if you reached out to me. But we can share some of those links, and you can share it with your broader audience if you'd like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually, we do have a page on our website with some CMMC resources that has some links on it. But I would be interested in seeing what you want to share with us. We can add to our library and help
Sure.
Our audience. I don't actually have any more questions coming in right now from the audience or anything else that we have prepared, but is there anything that you feel like we haven't covered that we should? And I encourage while you're talking, if anybody has any questions, now is the time to ask.
I just want to foot stomp that the importance of what we're doing here as a community, as an extended DoD department, from a DoD and a DIB perspective, what we do is a team sport. We rely upon industry to develop and build the tools and capabilities of the things that we need, and we rely upon our industry partners to get that work done. And companies need to do their part to help protect the information. One of the things that we did not talk about was, where does CUI come from? So let's talk about that real quick while we got a moment.
Sure.
Because that's part of it's a team sport aspect of, cyber is a team sport. So a lot of times questions come up where, hey, I don't even know what is CUI in my contract. What should I do next? So a couple things. One, if you're not sure what is CUI, you need to go back and have a conversation with your contracting officers or the PMs to understand what's important to them. The other thing is, you should probably look at the documents and those procedurals and various contract documents that come your way, and actually look at how those documents are marked. If it's anything other than public release, it's probably CUI. If it's got any sort of restricted distribution on it. Tech data packages are a classic one that we're all familiar with. Those are almost always at least CUI. The other thing that gets left out of the conversation, though, is CUI actually gets developed on the contractor side and provided back to the government. Mm-hmm. And that's got to be part of the dialogue and discussion as well, to understand how do we account for those documents, design documents, tech standards, those sorts of things that get developed in the construct of a program. That's inherently CUI at a minimum. So in that case, you really need to have a conversation and understanding with those that you're doing work for. For prime contractors, you have an additional responsibility of understanding what you share and who you share it with in your supply chain. You don't want to share information that needs to be protected with companies that either A, don't have a need to know the information, or two, don't have the means to protect the information. So it's very important that you understand what you need to protect and who's going to be exposed to that information, and do they have the means to protect that information. Remember what I said a minute ago about asking your suppliers for their self-assessments. That's one of the reasons why we keep saying that, even though that's not what the requirement requires, that clause doesn't require it. There's no reason you can't multi-purpose that self-assessment to communicate between primes and subs that an assessment and a capability exists to protect information.
Yeah, and we do get the question a lot, like, how do I know that I'm even supposed to be worried about NIST 800-171? And I mean, the very basic answer, I think, is if you have that 7012 clause in a contract that you were trying to bid on, then you have to, that's the whole point. Like, that you have to be 800-171 compliant. Is there any possibility of being on a contract that didn't require, that doesn't have that clause, but it becoming something where the contractor actually ends up creating CUI for the project?
Yes, it can obviously from an academic perspective, yes. So sure. let's say we have a scenario where you're a commercial provider, you've always been a commercial provider, there's really no CUI exchange between the two. And then the company makes the corporate decision that, hey, we're going to go into the development side of things and we're going to start doing customization. Guess what? You just went from the COTS exemption potentially into the 7012 applies world. That is very conceivable. I can tell you from personal experience, once that interim rule was published back in November, I've taken calls from several companies that went through that very scenario. Hey, we're a COTS guy today. This is all we've done today, but we want to get into the development side, into the, you know, the other side of the business. What would you advise? Well, if you want to get into that world, you got to start prepping, because to Jessica, to the point you made earlier, you don't make these changes overnight. You don't put these mechanisms in place at the drop of a hat. So it takes time, it takes energy. And oh, by the way, keep in mind that this glide path that we're talking about sets you up to be able to bid for those contracts under CMMC when that's a requirement. So if you're handling CUI today, you're targeting a CMMC level 3 assessment in your future.
Mm-hmm.
If you're doing work on critical programs and technologies, and for those of you that know what that phrase and term means, you know that you're working on those kinds of things, those crown jewels, if you will, of the Department of Defense, you may actually be targeting a higher level assessment. You know, that's a conversation for another day. If you're not one of those companies that handles CUI, then there is a possibility that you'll only operate at the CMMC level 1 level. But you know, don't think that is always the case. A lot of folks don't realize just how much CUI they do handle.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're handling CUI of any sort today and you're going to continue to do that, you need to start prepping yourself for that level 3 assessment.
Yeah, and when it really comes down to it, you know, the final message, I think, is that this isn't just good for the government, this is good for your business. And these are minimal cybersecurity defenses that you should have in place anyway. So the sooner that you get started, the better. I know that we have a hard stop at 3, sir, so I don't want to keep you any longer, but thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate the time, and we look forward to talking to you in the future.
Hey, we're here to help. If you ever need us, just let us know. Thanks for everybody being here today. It was a pleasure to be here with you, and I look forward to our next opportunity.
Great, thank you. And everybody, please do check out Artilist website, artilist.com. Thank you so much for joining us today. And we are going to be doing a lot of these events in the future. So you can track that on our events page and sign up for our newsletter and keep informed of that. So thank you so much and have a great day. Bye-bye.
Take care.